Once, on the edge of a quiet village, where the dust met the first signs of the wild, lived a girl named Netsai. She was no ordinary child, for she walked with the aid of crutches, her legs unwilling to carry her like the others. Yet her spirit soared beyond her frailty, held aloft by the warmth of her grandmother's love, and the melodies of an ancient Mbira, a traditional African musical instrument with metal keys mounted on a wooden soundboard, played by plucking the keys to produce rhythmic, melodic tones that resonate deeply with the spirit. Her grandmother, Gogo, was the first to place the Mbira in Netsai's hands. "Close your eyes, my child," she would say, guiding her frail fingers over the metal keys. "Feel the music. Let it carry you beyond what your legs cannot." And so, beneath the great Msasa tree, they would play, Netsai's small, hesitant plucks gradually growing bolder under her grandmother's patient guidance. The music became their bond, a bridge of love woven through melody and rhythm. When Netsai played, the world faded. The pain in her legs, the weight of her difference, the whispers of others, all disappeared beneath the Mbira's enchanting spell. Gogo would sway gently, humming along, her voice melding with the warm notes as if summoning spirits of old. "Music, my sweet child, is the voice of the ancestors. It will never leave you, even when I do." Batsy was an occasional visitor, a boy who never spoke, not because he didn't wish to, but because the gods had taken his voice before he could ever use it. No healer, no root, no charm had ever changed his silence. When he visited, he and Netsai spoke in a language of their own, one of music, of laughter, of quiet companionship as they sat beneath the Msasa tree, plucking the metal keys of her beloved Mbira. He had not yet learned to play, but he would watch, listening intently to the way her fingers danced across the instrument. At times, she would place his hands on the wooden soundboard, guiding him as her grandmother once did for her. He would fumble at first, but Netsai would always smile, encouraging him with nods and gentle pats. Their melodies were not yet in harmony, but in those moments, a seed of understanding was planted between them. Soft sounds of mourning, women wailing, the distant call of an owl. Then one evening, Gogo's breath grew shallow. She lay on her mat, her once strong hands weak and trembling. Netsai sat beside her, clutching the Mbira, refusing to believe what she knew was coming. With great effort, Gogo reached out and placed her wrinkled hands over Netsai's. "This Mbira, it is yours now," she whispered. "It carries our stories, our joys, our sorrows. Let it be your voice when words fail." And then, just as a gentle breeze sighs through the trees before dusk settles, Gogo was gone. For days and days, Netsai returned to her grandmother's resting place, the Mbira clutched against her chest. She would sit in the dust, her tears falling onto the wooden soundboard, her fingers trembling as she played. The melodies were sorrowful, filled with longing, each note a call to the one she had lost. The villagers would pass by, their gazes heavy with pity, but no one disturbed her. Her legs, already fragile, began to give in under the strain of the daily journey. The pain became unbearable, but the thought of not playing for Gogo was worse. She would drag herself there if she had to. But one day, her body refused to carry her any further. She sat at the edge of the path, tears streaking her dust-covered face, the Mbira limp in her lap. And then he came. Batsy, the quiet boy, the one who only visited now and then, began to come every afternoon. He did not speak, for he never had, but he sat beside her, his presence unwavering. He did not try to take her pain away, he simply shared it. And together, they played. At first, Netsai's melodies were heavy with sorrow, her fingers sluggish. But Batsy, who had once only watched, now placed his hands on Mbira as well. He followed her lead, plucking the metal keys with soft, tentative strokes. Their music shifted, their sorrow interwoven into something new, something deeper than words. Day after day, they sat beneath the Msasa tree, playing as the sun dipped below the horizon. In that music, Netsai found the strength to keep moving forward. And in that music, Batsy found a voice he never had. Netsai's grandmother, the only shield between her and the world, departed into the land of ancestors. Netsai was alone, but for Batsy, who sat beside her most afternoons in the silent way only he could. His presence a comfort words could never give. A neighbor, a woman with sharp eyes and a heavy tongue, would check on Netsai from time to time. She saw things, noticed signs that made her uneasy. The girl who had once carried the sorrow of loss alone now carried something more, something unspoken, something dark. In the days that followed, Netsai and Batsy became inseparable. What had once been occasional visits turned into an unspoken ritual. Every afternoon, as the sun leaned toward the horizon, Batsy would arrive at the msasa tree, waiting for Netsai. She would be there, Mbira in her lap, its wooden surface worn smooth by years of her grandmother's touch. It was no longer just an instrument. It was the last gift of love, a vessel of memory, a voice when words failed. And now it was something else. It was the thread that wove two silent souls together. At first, Batsy had only listened. He watched her fingers dance over the metal keys, producing melodies that spoke of sorrow, longing, and quiet resilience. But Netsai was patient. She took his hands and placed them on the Mbira. "Play what you feel," she whispered. The Mbira listens. It doesn't ask questions. It only sings back. Batsy's fingers trembled at first, the notes uncertain, like a whisper lost in the wind. But Netsai nodded, her gaze urging him to continue. He pressed down again, a clearer sound, another, a pattern, a conversation without words. Day by day, his confidence grew. His hands, once hesitant, became sure. His melodies, once clumsy, wove into hers, forming harmonies that filled the silence between them. The village took notice. It began as curiosity, a passing villager stopping for a moment, drawn in by the unfamiliar sound of two Mbiras weaving together. Then, a mother carrying firewood, pausing in the road. A shepherd boy standing at the edge of the path, tilting his head. The melodies reached further than the tree's shade. They touched something deeper, something old, something the village had forgotten, the healing power of music. And yet, in the quiet corners, there were whispers, watching eyes that saw something different. Eyes that misunderstood. A sharp gaze, narrowed eyes. The murmurs of gossip begin, small but insistent. One evening, Mai Dubé stood at the doorway of her hut, arms crossed. She had seen Netsai's sorrow, the exhaustion on her face, the way her hands trembled when she played, and yet she saw only one thing, Batsy, always near. A mute boy who watches too closely, a girl who carries a secret in her eyes. Something is not right. The whisper lingered in Mai Dubé's thoughts, growing heavier with each passing day. Doubt took root in her mind, twisting the simple bond between Netsai and Batsy into something uncertain, something troubling. The village sleeps under a blanket of darkness. Crickets sing in the distance, and the faint rustling of leaves drifts through the air. The embers of a dying fire glow outside Netsai's hut, casting flickering shadows against the mud walls. The night had settled deep over the village, its silence heavy and thick. Netsai lay curled on her sleeping mat, her Mbira resting beside her, the only comfort in the loneliness that had taken root since Gogo's passing. The walls of the hut had once felt safe, but now they felt thin, as if the night itself could slip through the cracks. And then she heard it. At first, it was just a sound, a shift in the wind, or perhaps a stray animal passing by. But then the sound grew, a footstep, another, slow, deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. A shadow loomed against the faint glow of the embers outside, blocking the slivers of light that crept through the gaps in the door. The wooden latch trembled, then lifted. A quiet creak filled the hut as the door inched open. The intruder revealed. A dim silhouette steps inside, the light from the embers barely illuminating the figure. The scent of sweat and earth fills the space. Netsai's fingers curled around the Mbira, clutching it as though it could shield her. She wanted to scream, but fear gripped her throat, choking the sound before it could rise. The intruder moved closer, their breath thick in the air. A whisper, barely audible, slithered from the darkness. "Be silent." Tears welled in her eyes. Her body refused to move, frozen beneath the weight of terror. The hand that reached for her was rough, familiar. The unmistakable village scent of goats and cow dung. A hand clamped over her mouth. She struggled, her crutches lying uselessly just out of reach. Her mind screamed even as her lips could not. The walls of the hut bore witness. The Mbira lay helpless at her side, and outside, the village slept on. The embers have faded to cold ash. Netsai stares at the ceiling, unmoving, unblinking. The faintest light of dawn creeps through the door. When it was over, the night did not leave her. It clung to her skin, soaked into her bones. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. She did not cry. The tears refused to come. Instead, she stared blankly at the door the intruder had left open until morning. All she could think was of her grandmother and how she would have been there for her in a situation like this. Outside, the world awoke, unaware. This was the first strike. He would come back after 2 days. The sun casts long shadows over the village as women return from the river, balancing clay pots of water on their heads. A soft breeze carries the sound of murmuring voices and the occasional laugh of children at play. In the distance, Mrs. Dubé watches from her doorway, eyes narrowed, lips pursed. Mrs. Dube was a woman who noticed things. She noticed when the maize stalks grew shorter than they should. She noticed when a wife walked faster than her husband, a sign of disrespect in her eyes. And now she noticed Netsai. Netsai had changed. The girl who once smiled, who once greeted people as they passed, now moved with difficulty, her crutches pressing into the dirt, her head lowered, her shoulders hunched. She had become quiet, withdrawn. And Mrs. Dubé had also noticed the boy, Batsy. He was always there, lurking, sitting in silence, watching Netsai too closely, a boy who did not speak, yet always near her. It was unnatural, it was suspicious. Mrs. Dubé had begun to visit Netsai more often. At first it was kindness, bringing small offerings of food, checking if the girl needed anything. But her questions grew sharper. "Are you all right, child? You seem different." Netsai would nod, force a small smile, and say nothing. But silence did not satisfy Mrs. Dube. She watched. She listened, and she began to believe she knew the truth. A crackling fire in the evening, women gathered around, their voices hushed but urgent. Mrs. Dube did not confront Batsy. No, she carried her suspicions to the women at the well, to the men gathered under the baobab tree. "I see the way he looks at her," she murmured. "I see the way she flinches when he's near. That boy, something is not right." And like wind through dry grass, the whispers spread. "A boy like that, mute and strange, who knows what's in his mind? Poor Netsai, she has no one to protect her. The boy should be questioned, he should be watched." The men of the village came at dusk. They found Batsy sitting beneath the msasa tree, his Mbira resting on his lap. He did not see the blow coming until it struck, hard and unforgiving. "What have you done to her?" they demanded. Batsy could not answer. He tried to resist, but hands grabbed him, held him down. A fist crashed into his ribs, another against his cheek. Netsai screamed, pushing through the crowd. "Stop! Stop! He's done nothing!" But the village did not listen. And in the distance, Mrs. Dubé watched from her doorway, lips pursed, eyes narrowed, satisfied that justice had been served. The night was thick with silence, but for Netsai, it carried the weight of dread. She had barely recovered from the last time, yet here it was again. The door creaked open, the scent of sweat and goat dung filling the air. A familiar presence loomed, casting a shadow over her trembling form. Helpless, she closed her eyes, wishing herself away, but the night was relentless. The next morning, she limped further, her crutches dragging through the dust, her body aching, her spirit hollow. But she did not cry. She never cried. And Batsy, seeing the deepened pain in her eyes, knew. He did not need words to understand. The village did not understand. And Mr. Dubé, leading the charge, seemed to take pleasure in the beatings, as if punishing Batsy had become a personal vendetta. With every strike, there was a gritted smirk, a force too cruel to be about simple justice. But Batsy did not break. He never broke. And after, when the bruises swelled and the blood dried, they played. They played because it was the only thing left to do. Their music carried them far away, beyond the pain, beyond the village, beyond the walls of their suffering. Their melodies weaved through the trees, into the sky, into the place where the spirits dwelled. And there, for a moment, they were free. Netsai and Batsy sat beneath the msasa tree, their mbiras whispering melodies into the night. Their fingers moved in sync, their pain dissolving into the rhythm. That night, they played longer than usual, unwilling to let the silence claim them. But the night grew cold, and Netsai shivered. Batsy noticed this and gently lifted her into his arms, carrying her back to her hut. She clutched her Mbira to her chest, and he set her down carefully before closing the door behind him. The embers outside flickered in the darkness as he hesitated for a moment, then turned toward the barn. It was too late for him to make the long journey home, and he knew the village paths were no place to walk alone at that hour. Batsy settled into the barn, the scent of hay and earth surrounding him. His body was sore, his mind heavy, but he listened. Netsai's hut was close enough that if anything happened, he would hear. He always listened. What he lacked in speech, he more than made up for in his heightened sense of hearing. The night was heavy with silence, disturbed only by the occasional cry of a distant owl. The village slept, unaware of the horror that lurked in the darkness. Netsai lay awake in her hut, her fingers resting on her Mbira, its presence the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The bruises had not yet faded, but neither had the fear. The air in her hut was thick, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. She had learned to move quietly, to sleep lightly, to anticipate the weight of footsteps approaching in the night. But nothing could prepare her for the moment when the door creaked open again. The scent entered first, that unmistakable mix of sweat, goat dung, and something far more sinister. The silhouette followed, broad and familiar. She whimpered. "Not a sound," he growled. Her fingers curled around her Mbira. It was all she had. Her voice, her shield, her only escape. But escape was impossible now. A gust of wind rustled the trees, carrying the faint melody of the Mbira through the night. In the barn, Batsy stirred, his senses alert. Batsy had not gone back home because they had played till late. He had found refuge in the hut in the compound that had once belonged to her grandmother and was now used for storage. Even from there, he could always hear Netsai's playing. Even on nights when her melodies were weak, fragmented by exhaustion, he listened. But that night was different. The sound that drifted toward him was not a melody. It was broken, frantic. Something was wrong. Without thinking, he rose, his body sore from the beatings, his limbs protesting. But pain was nothing. He moved toward the hut, the night swallowing his footsteps. He saw the door ajar, the shadow inside. Inside the hut, a struggle. Netsai gasped, her crutches knocked aside, a hand clamped over her mouth. But then, a new presence in the room. Batsy did not hesitate. With a wooden staff in his hands, he lunged, striking without thought. The intruder staggered, his grip loosening. Netsai fell back, gasping for air, her wide eyes locking onto Batsy. The man turned, furious, his face illuminated for just a second by the glow of the dying fire. Mr. Dubé. The realization was instant, but there was no time for shock. The man swung at Batsy, a heavy fist catching his jaw. Batsy reeled back, but he did not fall. He had survived worse. He had endured pain before, and he would endure it again. With every ounce of strength left in him, Batsy attacked. The staff connected with Mr. Dube's ribs, a pained grunt. Another blow, his arm. The intruder stumbled back, cursing under his breath. He was not used to being fought. He turned and fled, vanishing into the night, his breath ragged. Netsai and Batsy stood in the silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The Mbira lay between them, untouched. Netsai's breath came in short, shallow gasps. Her body ached, her soul even more so. But she was not alone. Not anymore. Batsy wiped the blood from his mouth, his hands trembling but strong. He turned to Netsai, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than any words could have been. And then, as if to reclaim the moment, as if to push back against the darkness, Netsai reached for her Mbira. She pressed a key, a single note. Then another. Batsy joined her, his hands steady despite the pain. Together, they played. Their music rose into the night, carrying with it everything they could not say. And though the village still slept, unaware of what had transpired, the spirits heard them, and the night listened. To be continued. Please subscribe, put a thumbs up, and share this video if you like it.